right, guys, today's video is going to be about the digestive system. We're just going to see how far we can get with this one before it starts to get too long. And if we need to, we'll break it into 2 videos. All right, so first we're going to start with some vocabulary. The first thing being is the words that we can use for our digestive tract. So your digestive tract can be called your alimentary canal. And that alimentary canal is going to run all the way from the mouth to the anus. So it's one continuous tube. If you look at this picture over here on the right, where the apple is coming in here at the mouth, and it travels all the way through that alimentary canal until it reaches the anus at the bottom. That alimentary canal, you guys are going to be responsible for the order of passage of things through it. So we can go ahead and get that part down now. So mouth to pharynx, which is essentially our throat area, down to the esophagus, which is the tube that will take the food down to the stomach. And we're going to talk about each one of these organs individually. So from that esophagus into the stomach, from the stomach into the small intestine, and from the small intestine through the large intestine until it then exits the body through the anus. So for speed purposes, we will probably not write any of these out ever again. So stomach is ST, small intestine, you're going to see SI, and for large intestine, you're going to see LI. There are definitely other organs that are associated with the digestive system, but the alimentary canal, or the GI for gastrointestinal tract, that is only the organs that the food actually passes through. So that's why these are kind of separated out into that alimentary canal, because they're the only areas, again, where the food is actually passing through. So let's look at some of the things our digestive system will do for us. So the first one here is we need to ingest the food. So when we ingest the food, all we are doing is getting the food into our body. So that's going to require our mouth, our teeth, our lips. Okay, but that's what we're doing there. We're getting that food into our body. After it's into the body, we need to propel it. So we need to do propulsion. Make that a little bigger so you can see it quickly. Okay, so we need to do propulsion. We need to push that food along the GI tract. And there's a couple of particular movements that can help us with that. Swallowing, as well as peristalsis. Peristalsis is a rhythmic muscle contraction. And so kind of like how a snake kind of pushes food along. Okay, if you imagine there's the food bulge right here. So here's food in this tube. And then we contract the muscles behind it. So the food pushes forward. And then we contract again and it pushes forward again. Okay, that's our peristalsis. So using those muscles to help push that food forward. So that's our propulsion. So we need to know kind of the quote unquote fancy terms for these. The third thing is the mechanical breakdown of the food. So the mechanical breakdown, this is going to be the actual physical breakdown of the food. Nothing with enzymes and chemically splitting the food apart, but physically breaking the food apart. So this is going to involve both chewing as well as churning. So by churning, this is when the stomach, the small intestines, they're both going to help do this. They're essentially just mixing the food. That's what we mean by churning. So we have to chew it, break it into smaller pieces, mix it up. So we can, all of this, the point of this mechanical breakdown is to increase the surface area of the food. And when we increase the surface area of the food, that's going to help us with number 4. Number 4 is our chemical breakdown of the food, or our chemical digestion of the food. So this is when our body is using enzymes now. So we're using enzymes in the stomach and in the small intestines to take these large pieces of food, these polymers, and turn them into monomers. For example, little 9th grade review here, right? If I eat a protein, like a piece of meat, piece of chicken, piece of beef, right? I eat a protein. This chemical digestion is breaking that protein down into the individual amino acids that make that protein up, because that's what our body actually needs. It doesn't need a whole protein. It needs the amino acids that made that protein, so we can then make our own proteins. Okay, if you really think about it, let's stick with the chicken as an example, right? If I'm eating a piece of chicken meat, that's made of chicken proteins. Well, I'm a human. I don't need chicken proteins. I need human proteins. But both chickens and humans use the same amino acids. So I can consume that chicken protein, break it down into amino acids, and rebuild those into the human proteins that I need. Okay, number 5 here is going to be absorption. This is how we're going to actually get the small food particles now into the bloodstream. So they're going to move into the bloodstream. You can see that happening right here, so that the small food particles can then be transferred throughout the body. Okay, and then our last part here is the defecation. This is the removal of the solid waste. So the removal of any food that wasn't absorbed. So that's why, again, it's our solid waste. Okay, so we already talked about this alimentary canal in the gastrointestinal tract. So we're just going to quickly kind of show you where the parts are located. Again, we'll talk more about each one in depth. So remember, this is only referring to the areas that the food physically passes through. So we start with the mouth. We start with the pharynx throat area. Then we move to the esophagus, the tube taking the food down to the stomach. From the stomach, the food will move into the small intestines. Small intestines are those there. Small intestines, from the small intestines into the large intestines. From the large intestines, it will then finish up through the anus. So that will be the path the food takes through this alimentary canal. Let's look a little bit closer at the general structure of the alimentary canal itself. So these are going to be our basic layers of the alimentary canal. The thickness of each layer will differ from area to area that we are in the particular within the canal, but they will all have these same basic layers. So the innermost layer is going to be this mucosa layer here. So the mucosa layer is going to be made up of a mucous membrane. And that mucous membrane is going to help protect the alimentary canal itself. That mucosa is going to be made of epithelial tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue lines, it always has a free surface. And so it lines cavities that are open to the outside, which our alimentary canal is open to the outside, both at the mouth and at the anus. So technically all the way through, it is open to the outside. So it is going to be epithelial tissue that is going to be coated with a mucus, so that that mucus is going to help reduce friction. It's going to help prevent the alimentary canal tissues from drying out, because remember, they're exposed to air since they're open to the outside. So we can't have the tissue dry out, as well as it's going to help lubricate the canal so that the food will pass through it without scratching it up and tearing it up. Okay, so underneath that mucosa, like we talked about when we talked about epithelial tissue before, I'm going to have a connective tissue layer. And that connective tissue layer is going to supply all my blood supply for this tissue layer. Remember, because the epithelial tissue doesn't have its own blood supply. It was avascular. So that's our first layer there, this mucosa layer that again consists of the epithelial tissue that's attached and anchored there with the connective tissue. The second layer is the submucosa. So here's our second layer, the submucosa. Remember, sub means under. So this layer would be underneath the mucus layer, the mucosa layer. And it's going to, again, consist mostly of connective tissue. Change color here, easier to see. So this is going to consist mostly of connective tissue. And in particular areas, So in certain areas of the alimentary canal, it may release digestive enzymes, but it depends on where in the canal you are. But it's mostly a connective tissue layer. So again, providing blood supply, providing structure, support, nerves, that kind of thing. Our third layer is the muscle layer. So the muscularis externa. So the muscularis externa, this muscle layer here, it's what's going to help us move and mix the food. Okay, so I'm going to come up here. Number 3, the muscularis externa. So it's going to be smooth muscle, right? We don't get to control that. It's going to be involuntary. Remember, if you don't remember this stuff about tissues that I'm talking about, make sure you're writing it down as we go, right? So the smooth muscle, it'll be involuntary. We don't control the mixing of our food, the peristalsis, the movement. We don't control any of that. Okay, so this muscularis externa will be smooth muscle. It's going to do that peristalsis. Again, that peristalsis is that rhythmic muscle contraction that helps in the propulsion phase. It helps push the food forward through the alimentary canal. And it also helps with that churning, right? The mixing, the helping to increase the surface area of the food. The final layer here is the serosa. The serosa is the outermost layer. So you can see here on this picture on the right there, that serosa is that outermost layer. So it is a serous membrane. So let's come over here, number 4. Right? It is a serous membrane. Remember, serous membranes, they help reduce friction because they're those double layered membranes and they have the serous fluid between them. And so that will allow when the organs of the alimentary canal change shape as the food moves through them, this allows them to move and shift around in our abdomen, in our thoracic cavity, and not cause pain or discomfort because there's a lot of friction there. Okay, this serous membrane, we've named all of our other serous membranes, pericardium, for instance, visceral parietal pericardium. So this in the abdomen, it is our visceral and parietal. Remember, the visceral layer is the one that touches the organ. The parietal layer is the one that touches the cavity wall. So again, write that down if you don't remember it. Okay, so the visceral and parietal peritoneum. So the visceral peritoneum is actually touching the surface of the organs. So in this picture here on the right, the visceral peritoneum would be this innermost layer that is touching the actual muscle layer, touching the organ itself. So, and then the parietal peritoneum would be the outer layer that is touching the body cavity wall. So the abdominal cavity wall, that be the parietal peritoneum layer. Okay, and you'll find that covering all of those organs in the abdomen there. The organs in our abdomen are going to be supported by what we call the mesentery. Okay, so there's your spelling there up in the left. So the mesentery. So the mesentery here is basically it holds the organs to the body cavity wall. Okay, and it's going to provide support for those organs in the abdominal cavity. And it will supply blood and nerves coming from the wall. So let's zoom in on, let's look at this picture over here on the right. Okay, so this is our spine right here, right? So there's the bones of our vertebrae, right? We've zoomed in on this area right here. So here's the bones of our vertebrae. This is the body cavity wall. Right back here. Okay, and so this green here, this is the mesentery. And you'll see how that mesentery is attached to each of these loops of small intestine. That's what these pink things are here. Those are small intestine. So you can see how that mesentery is running through all those layers of small intestine, and it's helping hold the small intestine up, right? So it doesn't all collapse and drop down to the bottom of the cavity here. It helps keep it up and supported throughout the cavity. And then within that mesentery, there's going to be nerves and blood vessels that are going to the small intestines from that mesentery. If you look at this transverse view over here on the left, right? Remember, transverse views cut things in half, like cut things top to bottom. You can see the mesentery in this layer as well. You can see our organs here, and then you can see some of this mesentery coming out and attaching it from the body wall. But that's what that mesentery will do. It's supporting the organs there. It's supplying nerves, blood vessels. Because again, your abdominal cavity, if you think about it, is just a big hollow space. There's not like shelves of bone that are holding anything up or holding anything in place. So this mesentery is the soft tissue that's helping hold all these organs up where they belong and the intestines up where they belong, so they don't all collapse down into the pelvic cavity and the base of the abdominal cavity. When we do dissection, you'll see this mesentery, and I think that will also help. Okay, let's start talking specific organs and areas within the alimentary canal. I know I'm talking kind of fast, and I'm trying to get through all of this and not repeat myself too much or anything, but remember, you can pause and rewind, right? And you can take your time with the video. If it's moving a little bit too fast, pause, get things down, rewind, hear them again, and make sure that you get them down then. All right, so let's look at the mouth or the oral cavity. So first of all, let's talk about what it does for us. All right, so our various functions for the oral cavity would be ingestion. Remember, that's the first step that our alimentary canal does. So ingestion, helping get the food inside of our mouth. It also helps us with step 2, mechanical breakdown of food, in particular the chewing of food. So helping physically break that food into smaller pieces so that we can increase the surface area and then do the chemical digestion. It also does some chemical digestion because there are enzymes in our mouth. Remember, enzymes are helping with the chemical digestion, breaking the food into the monomer, into the microscopic pieces. Okay? And the enzymes in our saliva help with chemical digestion, in particular of carbohydrates or sugars. That's why things immediately start to taste sweet when they're in our mouth, because we're already breaking down those carbohydrates. Okay? And then the last thing our mouth does for us is it helps with propulsion, because it does the swallowing, right? It pushes the food back so we can swallow, and the food can move further along the canal. So in preparation, essentially, for swallowing. So the parts of the mouth, right? We have the lips. Okay, and the lips, their job is to keep food in the mouth, right? We don't want food falling out of the front of the mouth. So they help keep the food in the mouth, and they also help grab the food. I think this is easier if you think about like animals. If you've ever seen like a horse eat or anything, how they kind of grab it with a horse, a rhinoceros, a zebra, they kind of grab it with their lips and pull the food in. Okay, so next we have the tongue. All right, so our tongue is going to help us with taste, right? It contains the taste buds on it, and so it will help us with taste. It actually helps us grip food. If you think about it, your tongue is kind of bumpy, so it helps grip the food. Okay? It also will manipulate and move the food around, again, to help push the food to the back of the mouth, to help manipulate it while we're chewing. Okay, and then we have our cheeks. Cheeks are similar to our lips in the fact that they form a border to the mouth, right? If you think about it, if you have no cheeks, as you were chewing, food would just be falling out the sides of your mouth. Okay, at the top here, we have the palate. So the palate essentially just provides the separation between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. That helps prevent food from mixing and going up into the nose area. Okay, and then we have the uvula, which is in the very back of the mouth. It's the little part that hangs down when the doctor tells you to say ah, right? It's what they're looking for it to lift up and move. The uvula is going to help prevent food from going backwards up into the nasal cavity when we swallow. So when you swallow, it kind of provides like a little, almost like a little flap, a little roof there to help prevent the food from going backwards up the nasal cavity when you swallow. And then obviously our teeth are in our mouth, and they play an important role in that mechanical digestion again, right? They're chewing, mixing the food up, breaking the food down. We also have associated with our mouth, we have some accessory organs. So we're going to periodically see accessory organs as we move through the larger parts of the alimentary canal. The accessory organs are going to be organs that help with digestion, but food does not pass through them. Okay, so again, these accessory organs, they help, but food doesn't actually physically pass through them. So a lot of them release like digestive enzymes or something that will help chemically break the food down. And then they secrete that into wherever the main organ is that the food is passing through. So associated with the mouth, we have the salivary glands. The salivary glands are going to be releasing enzymes. They're going to release saliva, and they'll release an enzyme called amylase. And that amylase is going to help with that chemical digestion, in particular of carbohydrates. It'll be breaking down the carbohydrates there in our mouth as we are chewing and mixing the food. Okay, we have three main sets of salivary glands. We have the parotid, we have the submandibular, and we have the sublingual. And we're going to look a little bit closer at those three on our next slide here. All right, so looking at these salivary glands separately, here's our parotid gland. It's a large gland on the side of our cheek, okay, a little bit in front of your ear, kind of on the top of your jawbone. If you feel kind of where your jawbone starts to curve and come straight, right above that, it'll be a little bit soft there. That is the parotid gland. Okay, sublingual, right? Sub means below, lingual is tongue. So this is the set here beneath the tongue. And then submandibular is going to be the set here behind the mandible, which is our jawbone, right? So we have these three sets of salivary glands here. They're going to release the saliva, which is going to consist mostly of water. Okay? It's going to contain some antibodies. Antibodies are going to help fight microbes, right? To help fight bacteria, foreign things that come in. There'll be a little bit of mucus. Not like full-blown snot, like what most of us think of when we think mucus, right? But a thin layer of mucus that's not strictly water. Again, we do want to coat these areas that are exposed to air so they don't dry out. Okay, and then again, it will contain the digestive enzymes, amylase that we mentioned on the previous slide, as well as lipase. Okay, amylase is going to be breaking down those starches and sugars. Lipase is going to break down lipids. So carbs, sugars, and then lipase will be breaking down those lipids. Okay, the job of the saliva, in addition to that chemical digestion for those enzymes breaking down the food, we're working to moisten the food. Right? You can't swallow something that's super dry and hard. Okay, so they're working to help moisten the food, to help lubricate the mouth. Okay, they're going to help protect against bacteria. Again, that's going to come from those antibodies that we find in the saliva. So protecting against bacteria and microbes. Okay, and just kind of in general helping us with that initial stage of digestion. So as the food moves out of the mouth, it's going to move down into the pharynx, which is our throat, and then down into the esophagus. The pharynx is broken into 3 different areas. You can see them listed on the picture here on the right. So we have nasopharynx, right, which would be nasal. This has no food. Food doesn't go up in this nasopharynx area. You'll see it's up here behind the uvula, up in the nasal cavity. Okay, then we have the oropharynx, right, oral mouth. So that is the back of the mouth area, the back of the throat. Okay, and then it says hypopharynx here, but you're going to see in your book and in most materials laryngopharynx, which means it's down by the larynx right here, right? This is our larynx or our voice box. And so it makes sense that this part of the throat here is called the laryngopharynx. So the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, they're the only parts that are going to actually have food pass through them. They don't do anything for digestion. I don't have enzymes here. I'm not churning or breaking down food. I'm just moving food through that passage to get it down so we can work its way to the stomach. Okay. In the laryngopharynx area, we are going to have the epiglottis. I'm going to clear this up a little bit so you can see it better. Okay. The epiglottis is that little flap there. The epiglottis is going to... It's going to be this flap right here. This front area here is our trachea, which is our windpipe. You know how people say the food went down the wrong pipe? We don't want food to go down into that trachea because it will go and it will sit in our lungs and it will cause infection. So we do not want food going down the trachea at all. So when we swallow, that actually pulls this side of the epiglottis up, which makes this side flop down and close. And so the epiglottis's job is to block off the trachea when we swallow so that food doesn't go down the trachea and it stays on track to go down the esophagus. So it's a really important role for that flap there in our throat. Again, it's called the epiglottis. The esophagus is this long tube right here. And the esophagus job, again, we're not doing digestion in the esophagus, neither mechanical nor chemical digestion. It's just a tube to move food. It is a muscular tube. The top, approximately 1/3 of it, is skeletal muscle, so that means we can control that. Remember, we control skeletal muscle. It's voluntary. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because the top 1/3 of that tube is going to be where I'm swallowing. And I want to be able to control if I need to swallow. And then the bottom, approximately 2/3 of it, is going to be smooth muscle. Once I get the food moved from my mouth, headed down my throat, now I don't need to spend voluntary resources on that. Now I can involuntarily control that. Okay? And so that esophagus is going to be traveling down from the pharynx, technically that laryngopharynx, all the way down to the stomach. So once that food gets into the stomach is going to take on a definite role in our digestion. The stomach is going to be doing both chemical and mechanical digestion. Okay, if you look at this picture of the stomach here, you'll see there is lots of muscle in that muscularis externa layer. Remember, the alimentary canal has a mucosa layer on the inside, then a submucosa, then a muscle layer, then the serosa layer. And the muscle layer in the stomach, there's a lot of muscle action happening there because it's helping churn and mix that food up, as well as then it's doing the chemical digestion by releasing enzymes. So in the stomach muscle, we have these sphincter muscles. Sphincter muscles are, remember, those are circular muscles in shape, and they're located at each end of the stomach. And what these sphincter muscles are going to do is they're going to prevent food from either leaving the stomach too early. So they prevent undigested food from moving to the small intestine. So this sphincter muscle down here, the pyloric sphincter, is going to stay closed until the food is nice and liquidy before it moves into the small intestine. And they also are going to prevent stomach acid from going up the esophagus. You can kind of think of them like the one-way valves in the heart, right? Only allowing food to go in, not allowing, and then it seals off so that stomach acid can't go back up, and only allowing food to go out when it is ready there into the small intestine. That's what heartburn is. When that, essentially the sphincter muscle at the top of the stomach there is not fully closing for some reason. Somehow acid is leaking back up into the esophagus, and the esophagus doesn't have the same lining, the same mucosal type lining. They're different in the stomach and in the esophagus because the stomach is prepared to be able to handle the acid in it, where the esophagus, the mucosa layer, is not prepared to handle that acid. So switching gears here then a little bit to the layers. So the lining of the stomach secretes a lot of mucus. So there's definitely mucus being released from that stomach lining there to help protect the stomach from acid, right? There's a lot of acid in the stomach that helps with the chemical digestion. Okay? It also helps kill microbes that may get down into our stomach. And so the mucosa layer of the stomach has to produce extra mucus to make sure that it's not essentially tearing itself up with the acid that it's releasing. So if we zoom in on our stomach lining here, so our stomach lining contains what we call a gastric pit. So you'll see where they've zoomed in here, and I'm looking at these little gastric pits. And in each of these gastric pits, I'm going to contain a gastric gland down closer to the base of the pit, and that's going to secrete gastric juice. Okay, gastric juice is going to be kind of a mix of a variety of things. So if we look at the types of cells that are in these gastric pits, okay, we have mucus cells. So those are obviously secreting mucus from them. We have parietal cells. Parietal cells secrete the hydrochloric acid that we see in our stomach. Okay, so you'll see HCl probably from now on. So the parietal cells release that hydrochloric acid. They also secrete what's called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is really important for vitamin B12. Okay, so it helps. That's the only way we can absorb vitamin B12 is by secreting this intrinsic factor from these parietal cells. So parietal cells secrete two things: hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor. Then we have the chief cells. The chief cells secrete pepsinogen. So pepsinogen is an inactive, it's an inactive enzyme. If we look up here on the top, we can see pepsinogen to pepsin in the presence of that hydrochloric acid. So this is part of why we need the acid in our stomach. The pepsinogen is released from these chief cells. There's step number 1 there. The hydrochloric acid is released from those parietal cells. When the hydrochloric acid, the pepsinogen in the presence of that hydrochloric acid now becomes pepsin. Pepsin is an active enzyme, so it can actively digest food now in that acidic environment of the stomach. Okay, so those are kind of the basic things that I'm seeing in the basic types of cells that we see in the gastric glands. So the thick muscular external layer is what's going to help our stomach do the mechanical physical churning and digestion. And then these gastric pits here that release the hydrochloric acid, the pepsinogen that gets activated to pepsin, they're going to help chemically digest the food. And then the mucus is going to help prevent the stomach lining from being destroyed by the acidic environment. When the food is kind of finished in the stomach, it's going to be what we call chyme. Chyme is going to be a mix of food and that gastric juice. So it's going to be liquidy. And that's when the food is now ready to move into the small intestine. So by now, we've chemically broken down carbs with the saliva. So we've started chemically breaking down carbs with the amylase in the saliva. We've started breaking down the lipids with the lipase. We haven't finished, also released in the saliva. And the pepsin has been breaking down the proteins. So we've been digesting the proteins now chemically, the carbs chemically, and have started digesting the lipids. So the food has gotten really liquefied, and we're now moving it into the small intestine. So the small intestine is where most of our food and water absorption is happening, because now we've done most of the breakdown of the food. We do a little bit more digestion here. We kind of finish everything up. We finish breaking down the carbs. We finish breaking down the proteins. We finish breaking down the lipids so that we can get everything absorbed into the bloodstream. Because like we said earlier, it needs to get absorbed into the bloodstream so that it can be carried throughout the body so that it can actually be used. Okay, so the intestine, the small intestines, it's going to have three parts. So we have the duodenum, which is the beginning, first part, relatively small. You can see here it's colored purple. So this would be attached to, here's my stomach right here. All right, so this duodenum is attached to the stomach. From the duodenum, we move into the jejunum layer. So here's the second area, okay, which is the pink on the picture here. And then from there, we move into the third layer, which is the ileum. We've let a lot of things go spelling-wise, but this ileum is is a big deal, because remember, we have hip bones that are ileums, but they are spelled differently. So you got to make sure you spell it right. So I-L-E-U-M, not I-L-I-U-M, because then you're talking about two totally different things. So from that ileum, from the small intestine, we'll then move into the large intestine. Okay, but you'll notice the small intestine, it's small because it's smaller in diameter, but it's actually very, very long because the food needs to spend a while in here because, again, we're finishing digestion and we're doing most of the absorption. So I need to spend a lot of time here so that those things can occur. All right, because the small intestine is a main area of absorption, we want to increase the surface area. The more I can increase the surface area of the small intestine, then the more I can absorb, because the more the food particles can come in contact with the different parts, with the walls of the intestines. So starting with these folds in the intestines, you'll see here on your picture, they're labeled large circular folds. Okay, those large circular folds here, they're called the plicae. They're called the plicae circularis. And those are these big, large folds that are already giving me a little bit of extra surface area here. From there, those plicae circularis, they have these like brushes on them. Okay, and that's my villi, the little finger-like projections. And then on each villi, you'll see I've zoomed in here. Each villi have these microvilli. So I've got these fingers like this for the villi, and then on each villi, I have more fingers. Right? So I have a villus, and then I have a microvillus on top of it. So what all of that is doing is if I unfolded all those folds, my surface area of my small intestines would be huge, especially compared to the other parts of my digestive tract. So that is allowing for a lot more absorption by increasing that surface area, which is pretty important. We want to make sure that's nice and as large as we can get it. And then you can see on this final zoomed in picture, you can see how on the villi, within each villi here, I have these blood capillaries. We're not going to worry about lacteals and such right now, but I have these blood capillaries that are allowing me, this is where that absorption is going to be taking place. So I can absorb those microscopic particles that the food has been broken down into now, and they can be transported throughout the bloodstream wherever they need to go so that I can use them then within my body. So like we did with the mouth, when we talked about accessory organs, we talked about those salivary glands. Let's talk accessory organs for the small intestines, because again, I'm finishing digestion here, especially in the beginning. And so I'm going to need some enzymes, some secretions that are going to help me do that. And those are going to come mainly from the liver They're going to come mainly from the gallbladder, and they're going to come mainly from the pancreas here. So let's talk first about the gallbladder. The gallbladder is going to release and store, you'll notice I didn't say make, it's going to release and store bile. The bile is actually made in the liver, but the gallbladder is where it's going to actually be released from and make it. Okay, the gallbladder is going to help emulsify fat. And this is going to be important because if you think about it, fat doesn't mix with water, right? And most of the solutions in our body are based off of water. So I need to find a way to help the fat mix with water so I can actually break it down into smaller pieces. And that's mainly the job of the bile, is to release that. When we release that bile, you can follow the green duct right here, right? When I release the bile, you'll see it go down right there into the front part of the small intestine. That's going to help emulsify the fat so we can finish breaking it down chemically. This is why if you know somebody that has gallstones or has had their gallbladder removed, they say they can't eat meals that are real high in fat because while they still make bile from the liver, they don't store it in those larger quantities. So they can't release as much as somebody else that has a gallbladder where they have the storage for it could. So when they eat that high fat meal, they have trouble digesting it and it can be uncomfortable for them. All right, let's shift gears now over to the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to have a variety of things that it secretes straight into the small intestine. So again, all of these are releasing secretions into the small intestine to help the small intestine pass the food through, absorb it, finish breaking it down. So the first thing is going to be bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is going to be alkaline. If you remember from your chemistry, your acids and bases and such, the bicarbonate is alkaline, which is basic. Therefore, it's going to help neutralize that mixture, that chyme mixture that comes out of the stomach. Remember, what's coming out of the stomach is a mix of the food and the gastric juices, and those gastric juices contain some of that hydrochloric acid. So we want to neutralize that before we move that into other organs so that we don't hurt those other organs. Okay, in addition to the bicarbonate solution, it's going to release pancreatic amylase. We've seen this enzyme before. We saw it in the saliva. And if we think back to the saliva, the amylase in the saliva helped break down the carbohydrates or the starches. And so what the pancreatic amylase is going to do is it's going to finish breaking down those carbs and sugars. The pancreatic lipase. So again, we saw lipase in the salivary lipase. Pancreatic lipase is going to do the same. It's going to help break down lipids and fats. Now I have that bile solution that was released from the gallbladder. And so those fats are getting emulsified, and then the lipase can step in and also break them down a little bit better now that the emulsification has happened. And then the last thing coming from the pancreas is going to be these inactive pancreatic proteases. Okay, proteases they're going to be activated further along in the small intestine. Okay, but these inactive proteases, basically, they're going to finish breaking down proteins. Right, ACE is an enzyme. So I'm releasing inactive enzymes that I'm going to activate later, essentially when as the food moves through. I don't want them active immediately because if they're active and there's no food presence, then they'll actually start breaking down the tissues of the pancreas and of the small intestine. So they get activated as they come in the presence of food in the small intestine. The liver is also going to help the small intestine with digestion, with a number of secretions and a number of jobs. Your liver is critical to your well-being. Okay, so one of the main jobs of the liver is to maintain our blood concentrations of various nutrients. So it's going to maintain blood concentrations. It's going to help maintain blood concentrations of glucose, right? It's one of the places we store our extra glucose so we can release it easily. If we need to pull it out of the blood, we can store it here. It's going to help maintain and monitor levels of lipids as well as levels of amino acids. Basically, the levels of those monomers that we would need to build our own polymers from the food. It can also convert nutrients. For example, if I take in an excess of sugars and I have nowhere to store them anymore, I will actually convert them into fats because fats are more efficient to store. And so when we take in too much sugar and we need to store that extra sugar somewhere, our liver will help us convert it into lipids or into fat tissue. Okay, it will do synthesis and storage, in particular of glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a sugar polymer, so it's a carbohydrate polymer. So again, when I have a lot of glucose, a lot of simple sugars, I can lock those together into these long glycogen molecules, and I can store them in the liver so that if I have a need for a quick intake of sugar and I don't have food, then I can release it from the liver. The liver will also do secretion for us. It will secrete cholesterol. Cholesterol is not all bad. Okay, we need some cholesterol. It helps with cell membrane maintenance in particular. Okay, so the liver will help secrete that and make that. It will secrete some of our plasma proteins. Those are proteins that we find in the liquid part of our blood. Okay, and it will secrete clotting factors. Clotting factors are also found in the blood. Okay, and so those plasma proteins and clotting factors are released into the liquid portion of the blood. The liver is going to store things for us. Okay, in addition to storing glycogen that we've talked about, the liver helps store iron for us. Iron is crucial for oxygen transport in the red blood cells. It'll store lipids for us, and it will also store what we call fat-soluble vitamins. Soluble means their ability to be broken down. Okay, and we have water-soluble vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins. For instance, if you're taking a fat-soluble vitamin as a supplement and you don't ingest any fat with it, that vitamin just passes right through you because you didn't have anything to help break it down and release it. Okay, most of us know that our liver is really important for detox, right? It's going to help absorb and deactivate or inactivate, neutralize various toxins, extra hormones, drugs, alcohol. All of that will essentially filter through the liver, and the liver will help break it down and try to clear it out of our system. It's also really, really important for certain particular blood circulation. So the blood that comes from the small intestine that has lots of nutrients in it, right? So the small intestine did all that absorption, right? So it pulled all that blood with lots and lots of nutrients in it. It sends it to the liver. Okay, and then the liver is going to process, store those nutrients, send out what needs to go out, filter out anything that was bad, do its detox job. But the liver will then process, store, make decisions essentially about what to do with those nutrients, where they're needed, that kind of thing. All right, so that's a lot with the liver and with the accessory organs that are associated there with that small intestine. But we really only have one major organ left now in our digestive tract. All right, so we have our final organ here. We have the large intestine. So the large intestine is the large intestine, like we said before, because its diameter is larger, not because it is actually longer than the small intestine. So the large intestine starts here at the cecum, right? This is where it's attached to the small intestine. So it starts here at the cecum. And then a synonym essentially for our large intestine is our colon. Okay, so then it will move through the colon, and you'll see we have an ascending colon, a transverse colon, a descending colon, and a sigmoid colon. So essentially food is going to come up in this direction like this. It's going to start on what would be your right side of your large intestine, move up the right side, across the middle, down the left side, and then back towards the middle, towards that pelvic cavity. From the colon area, the food would move to the rectum, and then from the rectum, the food would move out through the anal canal. Anything that wasn't absorbed, any remaining solid waste would move out through that, through the anal canal. So the cecum is going to have a valve on it, which will open and close in response to the presence of food, in response to hormones released by the stomach. Like we've already said, the colon has this ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid areas. Okay, these bubbles here on the colon, these are what are called the haustra. Okay, the haustra as they fill up, so as the food fills, let's say it fills this area here, that actually signals a muscle contraction behind it so that the food will move forward. Right, so that's how your body knows to push the food forward, is it'll receive these muscle contractions from these tenei coli. So the tenei coli here is this like strip of muscle right here. So as those haustra bubbles fill up with food, the muscle squeezes behind it and pushes it forward, finishes that propulsion. So the large intestine obviously is doing propulsion as it pushes the leftover food waste out of there. There is some more water absorption that can happen here, right? Get a little bit more water out of that food waste. And then there is some vitamin and electrolyte absorption happening here. Not too much, not nearly as much as in the small intestine, but still some is happening there. There are lots of bacteria that live in our large intestine. So lots of bacteria live here. This isn't a bad thing. Okay, so we talk a lot about gut health, right? And so the bacteria that are living in our large intestine, some of the ones that live there, they're going to actually make some vitamins for us. They're going to make vitamins B and vitamins K. So they will synthesize or make vitamins B and K. So that's pretty crucial for us to have those bacteria there present that are helping us with that. And then the final part of the colon here, the rectum followed by the anal canal, those are essentially storage. So the rectum is where the feces will actually be stored until there is enough feces to trigger the defecation or the release. And we probably should know what defecation is. Defecation is just our fancy word for going poo. Okay, but that's the physical act of releasing the waste through that anal canal. All right, so that's how the food is going to go in through your mouth, get broken down as it moves through, get absorbed, and then make the waste products head all the way out. I know it's a lot. Okay, this is definitely something you need to be practicing with as we move through the different vocabulary, the different enzymes, what's occurring at each different spot and different area.